Listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm Wilmer Leon, joined here by my co-host, Garland Nixon.
Thank you, Wilmer.
Well, Sputnik International reports Iran may rethink nuclear policy in light of threat from Israel. For several years, the Iranian leadership has stated it does not intend to create nuclear weapons and the development of atomic energy is exclusively for peaceful purposes. Well, due to recent acts of aggression by Israel, that mindset, we think, has changed. For insight into this, let's turn to our next guest. He holds the John J. and Rebecca Moores Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He's one of the most prolific writers of our time, and his latest books are entitled I Dare Say, a Gerald Horne Reader, and Acknowledging Radical Histories. Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, sir, welcome back.
Thank you for inviting me.
So, this really seems I've got two words on this one, Dr. Horne. Game changer. Your thoughts, sir?
Well, I think that the Iranian authorities have arrived at the inevitable conclusion from recent history. That is to say, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea has survived, not least because it is thought and suspected that they not only have nuclear weapons, but they have a delivery mechanism for them. Gaddafi in Libya and Saddam Hussein in Iraq did not survive, not least because Mr. Gaddafi decided to give the keys to his nuclear program to the North Atlantic countries, and they responded by overthrowing him and executing him on a camera. And we know about the dance between Saddam Hussein and the United States before the ill-fated U.S. invasion of 2003. And we also know that despite Mr. Bush's claim that the Iraqi authorities had weapons of mass destruction, apparently they did not, and that led to his overthrow. And I would warn and caution the Israeli authorities and their U.S. patrons that they're walking on eggshells right now. Because April 13th, despite the downgrading of it in the North Atlantic press, was similarly a game changer insofar as the Iranians demonstrated that they can deliver projectiles into Israeli backyards. And of course, despite the downgrading of this episode, there is evidence to suggest that targets such as military and intelligence bases were reached, were damaged, if not destroyed, not to mention the fact that the Iranians, rather cleverly, were able to gather intelligence on Israeli defensive mechanisms by sending hundreds of projectiles. And of course, they exposed the overrated mechanism known as the Iron Dome. Not only that, but as a result of April 13th and the Iranian response, we see that the puppet regime in Jordan is in jeopardy because it cooperated with the Israeli authorities. The wider context, of course, is this fundamental paradigm shift in the global correlation of forces. That is to say that the U.S.-led Group of Seven and the U.S.-led NATO are suffering punishing defeats one after another. They're being surpassed by the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, recently co-opting Iran, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Ethiopia. Soon, we are told to co-opt perhaps Algeria, Indonesia, Mexico. And so what we're going to see for some time to come within this changing correlation of forces will be the ability of the U.S. and their allies to attain tactical victories, such as killing perhaps thousands of Hamas fighters in Gaza or killing Iranian leaders in Damascus on April 1st. But inevitably, they lead, like night follows day, to strategic defeat. For example, the tattered global image of Israel in light of Gaza, and of course, the fact that the Iranians have been able to establish a muscular deterrence as a result of April 13th, a strategic defeat for the Israelis and their U.S. allies. And so in that context, even the rather quaint nostrum of former late Pentagon Chief Donald Rumsfeld that if you have a problem, the way to deal with it is to enlarge it, that no longer works either, because Israel enlarged the problem, thought they could distract attention away from Gaza by attacking the Iranians on April 1st, but it's just mushroomed into another strategic defeat. And so I don't think that the Israelis and their U.S. patrons have gotten the message, and evidence in that regard is an article in the current issue of Foreign Affairs published by the Elite Council on Foreign Relations on the posh Upper East Side of Manhattan by former Trump official Matt Pottinger, who is perhaps touted to be a future Secretary of State or National Security Advisor if Mr. Trump returns to the White House, and former Congressman Mike Gallagher, who called for an overthrow of the Communist Party of China. I think that from their point of view, the way to stop the BRICS is to basically destabilize the most powerful member of the BRICS. Also, rather remarkably, they also suggest that a holy crusade against China would be a way to reduce polarization in the United States, since both wings of the ruling class, the Biden wing and the Trump wing, are both anti-China. And so therefore, you can get them to stop fighting with each other as they unite on an anti-China platform. The problems here are so monumental, I don't even know where to begin. I mean, let's start with the obvious. The United States was unable to defeat Afghanistan, Vietnam, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. So how would they defeat the People's Republic of China, particularly since we know that the Federal Republic of Germany is not on board. Chancellor Scholz, as we've mentioned, is in Beijing as we speak, breaking bread with a plane load of German businessmen with President Xi Jinping. France is not on board, has done the same thing. And Australia, slated to play a leading role at the tip of the spear with regard to this anti-China crusade. The ruling class there is split with former Labour Party Chief Paul Keating denouncing the harebrained schemes coming out of Canberra, joined by analyst Hugh White, who is the kind of Henry Kissinger of Australia. And so these are harebrained schemes. They can only end in tears, particularly since the Shanghai Cooperation Organization is strengthening. But in any case, we know that the U.S. ruling elite is becoming ever more desperate. I know that you gentlemen would like to discuss the recent breaking story about how the United States is opposing United Nations membership for Palestine, despite the rhetoric to the contrary about favoring a so-called two-state solution. But sadly and tragically, the White House is in bad company. You might have seen the article in The Intercept that suggests that the style guidelines of the New York Times are telling their reporters to even avoid use of the very term Palestine, not to mention genocide, not to mention ethnic cleansing. We know from an investigation by Wall Street Journal journalists, that the New York Times has been investigating and fly-inspecting journalists of Arab descent and North African and West Asian descent because they feel that they've leaked the bombshell story about the hole in the story published some months ago about alleged Hamas sexual depredations against Israeli women on October 7th and thereafter. That investigation has gone nowhere. We saw the spectacle on Capitol Hill yesterday of the president of Columbia University, accompanied by members of her board, tossing faculty overboard to the wolves, the Republican Party wolves, and this spurious claim that somehow anti-Jewish fervor is sweeping through the Ivy League. As we speak, New York City Police Department officials are on the Columbia University campus arresting students. Students are being suspended for their pro-Palestinian activism, including the daughter of Congresswoman Omar of Minnesota. We see that Senator Tom Cotton of Arkansas, a Republican stalwart in good standing, has actually threatened violence against pro-Palestinian demonstrators.
Throw them off the Golden Gate Bridge. throw them into the San Francisco Bay over the Golden Gate Bridge. And for folks that don't know, that's where a lot of people go when they want to commit suicide. What do? They jump off the Golden Gate Bridge.
And of course, he's been accompanied by the officials at the University of Southern California who vetoed a commencement speech by a pro-Palestinian student who had a 3.98 out of 4.0 grade point average, supposedly because of violence that was threatened by pro-Israeli thugs.
Let me ask you one quick point on that, because the natural response should be, particularly at an institute of higher education, to protect the student. But instead of saying we are not going to succumb to these threats of violence and just not allow her the honor of her valedictorian speech, we're just going to sit her down.
Well, it's even worse, because it's well known in U.S. constitutional law that there should not be a so-called heckler's veto. In other words, you should not be empowering the hecklers. You should be empowering the person who wants to exercise the right of freedom of speech. But of course, as we march steadily to the right, constitutional principles are being thrown overboard like Columbia University faculty. But I think it's also important to recognize the rank hypocrisy that this idea of so-called cancel culture is fraudulent. That is to say, it's okay for some to be canceled, not okay for others to be canceled. The rules-based international order is likewise fraudulent. And it's important to realize that we are still in the midst of an apartheid society and apartheid ethos. And I would urge and caution our friends on the left to move away from this idea that the fact that certain societies like the United States moved away from the European ethos of the Holocaust and anti-Jewish fervor and incorporated the Jewish diaspora, that was not necessarily a step forward in terms of following a president that would allow Black people, for example, to be incorporated into this particular ethos. In fact, we know that this was a response to the fact that the settlers in this society, they needed more backup to confront Native Americans and enslaved Africans. In fact, you should go to the book by CNN commentator Fareed Zakaria on the Age of Revolutions, where he puts forward this harebrained idea that somehow it was a symbol of progressivism to incorporate this Jewish diaspora without recognizing that it was part and parcel of building settler colonial societies. So hopefully this moment, this fraught moment that we've arrived at, will allow for more insight. But somehow I doubt it with regard to those at the top of the socioeconomic pyramid.
Yeah, we've only got about 2 minutes or so, but there's a couple quick stories. One of them is the whistleblower says U.S. is putting troops in danger by refusing to leave Niger. But there's a whole bunch of stories that says Russian troops and military trainers are arriving in Niger. A couple of minutes.
Well, I think that we're seeing a transition. That is to say, the initial transition was away from French neocolonialism, which the U.S. imperialists advocated because they wanted to take their place. Recall that was the import of the United States pulling the rug out from under the French war in Algeria, not because the U.S. was progressive, because they wanted to replace the French in Algeria. But alas, the United States is now recognizing that the worm has turned, that their base in Niger, their drone base, which patrols a good deal of the Sahel region, reaching as far east as Somalia, is now under threat. And of course, they're in the process of being replaced and supplanted by Moscow. And so we also see that the nostrum of George H.W. Bush some decades ago, that the United States has more will than wallet, still obtains. And so the United States is not able to compete once again with China and the BRICS, except to supply missiles and drones, which is the last thing that societies in desperate need of healthcare and education need. So there you have it.
As always, with Dr. Gerald Horne, there you have it. Thank you so much for your time. Greatly, greatly appreciate that analysis, and we look forward to having you back.